The titanium leash snapped taut with a sound like a rifle crack. 70 pounds of pure, traumatized German Shepherd lunged, teeth snapping inches from a Navy SEAL's throat. They were the world's most lethal operators, losing blood and ground to a dog that just wanted to die. The Wyoming heat baked the dust into a fine, choking powder that tasted like pennies and exhaust. Cora stood by the chain-link fence, her knuckles white where she gripped the wire. Her tactical pants were stiff with dried sweat, the heavy fabric clinging to her thighs in the oppressive afternoon sun. Inside the pen, it was a bloodbath. "Get him off! Pin the collar, Miller! Pin it!" Hayes's voice cracked, stripped of its usual baritone authority. Miller, a guy who had breached doors in Fallujah without a flinch, was currently slammed against the dirt, desperately jamming his forearm into the throat of the German Shepherd. The dog, designated Co 9 Delta in the files, wasn't just fighting. He was trying to tear his way through Miller's Kevlar-reinforced bite sleeve to the bone beneath. The sound Delta made wasn't a growl. It was a wet, ragged scream, a noise born of pure, unadulterated panic. His black and tan fur stood rigidly on end, matted with dust and flecks of Miller's blood. Cora didn't move to help immediately. That was her first failure of the afternoon. She just watched, her chest tight, paralyzed by a sudden, sickening wave of recognition. The dog looked exactly the way she had felt waking up in a Baghdad hospital 3 months ago, cornered, terrified, violently lashing out at the hands trying to stitch her back together. "Cora, the gate! Open the damn gate!" The shout broke her trance. She slammed her palm against the heavy metal latch, the iron hot enough to blister. She hauled the gate back, the hinges shrieking. Miller kicked out, a clumsy, desperate heave that caught Delta in the ribs. The dog broke the hold, skidding backward in the dirt. Before Delta could rebound, Miller scrambled backward out of the pen, leaving a smear of crimson on the gatepost. Cora slammed it shut, dropping the heavy deadbolt into place. Delta didn't charge the fence. He retreated to the far corner of the enclosure, pressing his spine against the concrete block wall. He stood trembling violently, black lips peeled back to expose yellowed canines. Thick ropes of bloody saliva hung from his jaws. He snapped at the empty air, his dark eyes wide, dilated, and entirely devoid of reason. Miller sat in the dirt, clutching his arm. The bite sleeve was shredded, the heavy synthetic canvas torn open like cheap tissue paper. Beneath it, his uniform top was soaked. "Jesus!" Miller hissed, his face completely devoid of color. He looked up at Cora, his eyes wide and shiny with shock. He bypassed the sleeve. He went right for the elbow joint. He was trying to cripple me. Cora squatted next to him, her knees popping loud enough to be heard over the dog's frantic panting. She ripped open an Israeli bandage from her rig with her teeth, spitting the plastic wrapper into the dust. She didn't offer a comforting word. Comfort felt cheap out here. "Hold still," she muttered, her voice rough, lacking any bedside manner. She wrapped the dressing tight over the puncture wounds, her hands slick with his blood. The smell hit her, copper, adrenaline, and the sour stink of fear sweat. Hayes stepped up to the fence line, his boots crunching heavily in the gravel. He stared through the chain link at the trembling animal. "That's it," he said, his voice flat. "Call the vet. Have Evans bring the kit. We're putting him down." Cora's hands stopped moving. She tied off Miller's bandage, perhaps a little too tightly given the sharp intake of breath the man gave. She stood up, wiping her bloody palms on her pants. "He's fear-biting, Hayes," Cora said. Her voice didn't rise. She didn't sound impassioned. She just sounded tired. "Look at his tail. It's tucked so hard it's practically touching his stomach. His ears are pinned. He thinks we're going to kill him." "We're going to kill him, Davies," Hayes replied, turning his head just enough to catch her eye. "He's washed out. 3 handlers in 2 weeks. He nearly took Miller's arm off. He's damaged goods from that blast in Helmand, and he isn't recovering." "He's a piece of military equipment," Cora argued, playing the only card Hayes respected. "He cost the Navy $50,000 in training. You don't just scrap him because he's got PTSD. The acronym felt heavy in her mouth. Hypocritical. She hadn't let the brass write her off when she came back twitching at slamming doors. But here she was, defending a dog with the exact same clinical detachment they had used on her. He is a liability? Hayes turned fully toward her now. The commander was a wall of muscle and pragmatism. "I need operators, Davies. 2 legs or 4. If they can't operate, they go away. I'm not risking another man's life to rehabilitate a broken tool." Cora looked back at the pen. Oh, Delta was pacing now, a tight, frantic figure 8 in the dust. His claws scraped rhythmically against the concrete base of the fence. Scritch, scritch, scritch. The sound clawed at the inside of Cora's skull. She hated the dog for being weak. She hated Hayes for being right. Most of all, she hated the hollow ache in her own chest that told her she was looking in a mirror. "Give me 10 minutes, Cora said. The words slipped out before her brain could stop them. Hayes let out a short, humorless bark of a laugh. "You're a point man, Davies. You aren't a handler." 10 minutes. Cora stepped closer to the fence, her shoulder brushing Hayes's. "I go in. If I can't get a slip lead over his neck, Evans can put him to sleep through the wire." Hayes looked at her, his eyes narrowing, assessing her the way he assessed a tactical entry point. He saw the tension in her jaw, the rigid set of her shoulders. He knew her file as well as she did. "You go in there, you wear the heavy suit. All of it." Cora shook her head. "No, the Kevlar smells like Miller's blood. It smells like panic. He sees the suit. He sees a target." She reached up and unbuckled her tactical vest, letting the heavy ceramic plates drop to the dirt with a dull thud. She unholstered her sidearm and placed it on top of the rig. "Cora, you're out of your mind!" Miller rasped from the ground, still cradling his arm. She ignored him. She didn't feel heroic. She felt a cold, miserable certainty that she was making a massive mistake. But a stubborn, ugly part of her refused to back down. She grabbed a nylon slip lead. From the gearbox, the material rough against her calloused palm. She stepped up to the gate. The latch burned her fingers again. Inside, Delta stopped pacing. He locked eyes with her. The dog lowered his center of gravity, a low, rumbling growl vibrating in his chest. It sounded like an engine idling rough. Cora took a breath that tasted like grit and pushed the gate open. The heavy steel gate clanged shut behind Cora, the sound finalizing her isolation. The air inside the pen felt 10 degrees hotter, stagnant and thick with the smell of wet fur and fresh blood. She took 1 step forward. Her boot crushed a dry clump of dirt. Delta exploded. He didn't charge. He sprang vertically, hitting the chain link beside Cora with a violence that bowed the metal. The fence rattled like gunfire. Cora flinched hard, her shoulders jumping toward her ears, her heart hammering a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. She wasn't calm. She wasn't exuding the alpha energy the manuals talked about. She was terrified, and she knew the dog could smell the sour sweat blooming at her hairline. Delta dropped back to all fours, his front paws hitting the dirt hard. He bared his teeth, the growl escalating into a high-pitched snarl. He was cornered. backed against the cinder block wall, waiting for her to make the wrong move. Outside the pen, the silence of the tactical team was deafening. Cora could feel Hayes staring a hole into her back. "Davies," Hayes' voice came through the wire, tight and warning. "Back out, now." Cora swallowed dryly. She took another step, lowering her center of gravity, holding the nylon slip lead out loosely. "Hey," she croaked, her voice failing her. She cleared her throat. "Hey, buddy, easy." The words were hollow. The dog didn't care about her tone. He watched her hand, his eyes tracking the slight sway of the leash. His hind legs bunched, the muscles coiled like heavy springs beneath his coat. He was going to launch. Cora knew it. She braced herself, raising her left forearm instinctively to protect her face, knowing the thin cotton of her combat shirt wouldn't stop teeth that could crush bone. "Hold on there." The voice didn't come from the tactical team. It came from the gravel driveway behind them. It was a dry, raspy voice, carrying the quiet authority of someone who rarely felt the need to shout. Cora didn't take her eyes off the dog, but she saw the tension ripple through the seals outside the fence. Arthur Pendleton walked past the parked armored SUVs, his gait slow but steady. He was the owner of the sprawling, sun-scorched acreage the military had leased for their temporary staging ground. He wore faded Levi's, soft with age, and a plaid flannel shirt that had seen better decades. A battered Stetson cast a deep shadow over his lined, leathery face. He smelled of chewing tobacco, peppermint, and motor oil. "Sir, this is a restricted area," Hayes barked, moving to intercept the old man. "Step back to the perimeter." Arthur didn't even look at the commander. He walked right past Hayes, moving with a fluid, unhurried grace that made the heavily armed SEALs seem bulky and awkward. He walked directly to the fence line, stopping a foot away from the wire. "You're making him worse, miss," Arthur said, looking through the chain link at Cora. Cora gritted her teeth, her eyes locked on Delta. "I've got it under control," she lied, her voice shaking slightly. "No, you don't," Arthur replied mildly. He reached into his shirt pocket, his large hands knobby with arthritis and mapped with pale old scars. "You're stiff as a board. You're projecting fear. He thinks you're a predator, deciding where to bite first." "I said step back." Hayes stepped forward, grabbing Arthur's shoulder. Arthur stopped. He turned his head slowly, fixing Hayes with a look of pale blue water. It wasn't an angry look. It was a look of profound, immovable patience. "Take your hand off my shirt, son. I'm trying to save your dog." Hayes hesitated. In that split second of indecision, Arthur stepped away from his grip. He reached the gate. "Don't!" Cora shouted, breaking her stance and turning toward the gate. It was a mistake. Delta lunged. The dog closed the distance in a blur of fur and muscle, snapping his jaws inches from Cora's thigh. She scrambled backward, tripping over her own boots, hitting the dirt hard. The breath knocked out of her lungs in a sharp whoosh. Before Delta could follow up, the heavy metal gate swung open. Arthur stepped into the pen. He didn't wear Kevlar. He didn't hold a leash. He just stood there, a frail-looking old man in a dusty enclosure with a dog that had just shredded a grown man's arm. The SEALs yelled. Cora scrambled up, cursing, her hand flying to her empty holster out of pure instinct. She lunged forward to grab Arthur's flannel shirt to drag him back out, but her hand slipped on the soft cotton. She missed. Arthur took 3 slow steps into the center of the pen. He didn't look at Cora. He didn't look at the dog's teeth. He looked right into the frantic, dilated black eyes of the German shepherd. Delta froze. The dog's front paws were planted wide, his lips curled back. A terrifying snarl locked in his throat. He looked ready to tear the old man's throat out. Arthur slowly reached up and took off his Stetson. He lowered it to his side, his sparse white hair catching the afternoon sun. He took a deep breath, letting his shoulders drop. The entire posture of his body changed. The tension evaporated. He became a fixture in the dirt, quiet and rooted. The dog's growl stuttered. Arthur didn't hold out his hand. He didn't say, "Good boy." He just stood there, completely exposed, breathing slowly, deeply. "Ranger," Arthur said. The word wasn't a command. It was a recognition. It hung in the hot, dusty air, soft but impossibly heavy. Delta's ears flicked. The vicious rhythmic snarling stopped abruptly, replaced by a sharp, confused intake of air. The dog's weight shifted backward, off his front paws. Arthur took one step forward, the dry dirt sighing beneath his leather boot. "I know," the old man murmured, his voice rumbling low in his chest. "I know the noise never really stops. Does it, Ranger?" Cora watched, her mouth slightly open, her heart still hammering a chaotic beat. The German Shepherd, the killing machine that had terrorized a squad of Tier 1 operators, slowly lowered his head. The rigid line of his back broke. A soft, high-pitched whine escaped the dog's throat. It sounded like a sob. Arthur dropped to one knee, the joint popping loudly in the quiet pen. He patted the dust beside his leg once. The dog hesitated, his body trembling violently. Then, with a slow, agonizing stiffness, the German Shepherd crept forward, lowering his heavy, scarred head until it rested gently against the old man's worn denim knee. The silence in the pen was thick enough to choke on. The only sound was the raspy, uneven panting of the German Shepherd and the slow, rhythmic sweep of Arthur's thumb over the scarred bridge of the dog's snout. Cora stayed on the ground. The dirt pressed into her knees, hot and sharp. She realized her right hand was trembling, a tight, high-frequency vibration radiating from her wrist to her elbow. She clamped it over her left bicep, squeezing until her own fingernails dug into the fabric of her sleeve. She didn't feel relief watching the dog calm down. She felt a sudden, violently bitter spike of envy. The dog got to surrender. The dog got to lay his head on a stranger's knee and just stop fighting. Cora had to put her armor back on in 10 minutes. "Ah, Jesus Christ," Miller breathed from outside the fence, his good hand gripping the chain link. Hayes didn't share the awe. The commander's boots crunched heavy and fast toward the gate. He didn't enter. He wasn't stupid enough to trap himself in a confined space with an unpredictable variable. But he kicked the metal frame. The loud clang made the dog flinch, his head snapping up, ears pinning back again. "Don't do that," Arthur said. He didn't look up at Hayes. His voice remained at that low, even pitch, but the tone was suddenly flat, hard. "Step away from the asset, Mr. Pendleton," Hayes ordered, his hand resting instinctively on his belt. "You're interfering with military protocol. That animal is a biohazard right now. He's tasted blood." "He tasted fear," Arthur corrected quietly. He slid his hand down the dog's neck, his thick arthritic fingers slipping under the heavy tactical collar. It was a thick band of rigid nylon and cobra buckles designed to handle a parachute drop. It looked like a garrote on the dog's tense throat. "And you people reek of it." "Excuse me?" Hayes' voice dropped an octave. Cora finally stood up. Her joints popped. She felt heavy, her muscles sluggish and drained of adrenaline. She watched Arthur trace the buckle of the collar. "This isn't a handle," the old man murmured, talking to the dog, not the seals. "It's a shackle." With a sharp click, Arthur released the cobra buckle. The heavy collar dropped to the dirt with a dull thud. "Hey!" Hayes barked, genuinely alarmed now. "Davies, get that collar back on him. If he bolts, he's running from the men who've been dragging him through the dirt by his neck for 2 weeks," Arthur interrupted. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a length of braided cotton rope, worn soft and gray from years of use. He fashioned a simple slip loop, opening it wide. He didn't force it over the dog's head. He just held it out. The German shepherd sniffed the rope. It smelled like horse sweat, old leather, and Arthur. Slowly, the dog pushed his nose through the loop. Arthur tightened it gently, leaving plenty of slack. Cora watched the exchange with a sickening knot in her stomach. 2 weeks. 3 elite handlers had spent 2 weeks trying to dominate the dog, pinning him, shouting commands, using e-collars and titanium prongs to force compliance out of an animal whose brain was trapped in a compound in Helmand. And this farmer just took his hat off and waited. "We're leaving," Arthur said. He stood up, his knees cracking again. "You're not taking government property anywhere," Hayes said, shifting to block the gate. Arthur stopped. The dog stopped with him, pressing his flank tight against the old man's denim-clad leg. Arthur finally looked directly at the commander. "Son, I've got a lease agreement in my kitchen drawer that says your boys can use my south pasture for maneuvers," Arthur said, his voice carrying the dry rasp of sandpaper. "It doesn't say you get to run a slaughterhouse on my property. You want to shoot a dog, you load him up and do it on federal land. But right now, he's walking with me." "He is an active threat," Hayes countered, his jaw tight. "He just put Miller in the med tent. He's unhinged. He's tired." Arthur looked down at the dog. The shepherd was swaying slightly, his back legs trembling under the weight of his own exhaustion. "And so are you, it looks like. You boys go bandage your friend." Arthur walked toward the gate. Hayes didn't move. Cora stepped forward. She didn't think about it. She just moved, placing herself perfectly between Hayes and the gate. She didn't look at the commander. She kept her eyes on the dust. "Let him pass, Hayes," she said. Her voice was completely devoid of emotion. Hayes stared at the back of her head. "Davies, step aside. He's right. The optics of putting a bullet in a K9 in front of a civilian landlord are garbage," Cora lied, leaning on tactical pragmatism to cover the irrational, desperate need she felt to keep the dog alive. "Let the old man take him to the barn. He cools down. We tranquilize him tonight, crate him, and ship him back to Coronado. Let the brass euthanize him." Hayes hated it, but he hated a mess more. The commander looked at Miller, who was currently leaning against an SUV, his face pale and sweating. "Fine," Hayes spat. He stepped back from the gate. "But if that thing bites him, it's on you, Davies. You secure the animal by sundown." Arthur didn't say thank you. He just pushed the gate open and walked out. The German shepherd stayed glued to his left thigh, head low, tail tucked, completely ignoring the armed men they passed. Cora stood in the pen alone for a few seconds. The smell of copper and urine still hung in the hot air. She looked at the heavy tactical collar lying in the dirt. She bent down, picked it up, and felt the rigid, unyielding weight of it in her hands. She clipped it to her belt. Then, ignoring Hayes and the rest of the team, she turned and followed the old man's path up the dirt road. The barn was a massive, weathered structure of corrugated tin and rotting cedar. The air inside was 10 degrees cooler, heavy with the scent of dried alfalfa, machine grease, and old, sweet decay. Shafts of afternoon sunlight cut through the gaps in the roof, illuminating swirling vortexes of dust. Arthur sat on an overturned plastic bucket near a rusted John Deere tractor. The dog was lying on the concrete floor, his chin resting flat on the cold gray surface. His eyes were half open, tracking the barn swallows darting near the rafters. Cora stood in the doorway, her silhouette cutting a sharp, rigid line against the glare of the sun behind her. She didn't step inside right away. She felt like an intruder, an abrasive presence threatening the fragile quiet of the space. "You can come in," Arthur said without turning his head. "Just leave the noise out there." Cora stepped over the threshold. Her boots thudded against the concrete. The dog's ears swiveled toward her, but he didn't lift his head. "Is there a reason you called him Ranger?" Cora asked. She leaned her shoulder against a wooden support beam, keeping her distance. She crossed her arms, defensive, tightly coiled. Arthur reached down and unclipped the cotton rope from the dog's neck. "Had a brother in the 75th, Arthur said quietly. "Came back in 71. He had that same look in his eyes, like he was always listening for a sound he hoped he wouldn't hear." Cora's jaw tightened. She looked away, staring hard at a stack of burlap sacks. She hated how easily the old man had nailed it, the perpetual, exhausting state of anticipating the explosion. "There's a hose coiled by the spigot." Arthur pointed a thumb toward the back wall. "Grab that galvanized bowl and fill it up. He needs water." Cora pushed off the beam. She walked to the back, the aluminum bowl clattering slightly as she picked it up. She turned the spigot. The water groaned in the pipes before sputtering out, cold and clear. She filled the bowl and walked back, stopping a few feet from the dog. She hesitated. The memory of his teeth snapping at her thigh was still a vivid physical sensation pulsing in her nerves. "Put it down," Arthur instructed softly. "Don't hand it to him. Don't make him take it from you. Just put it down and step back." Cora crouched, her knees protesting, and slid the bowl across the concrete. It made a harsh scraping sound. She immediately stepped back. The dog didn't move for a long minute. Then slowly he dragged himself forward, keeping his belly pressed to the floor. He didn't stand. He just extended his neck and began to lap at the water. The sound was loud in the quiet barn, slurping, desperate, frantic. Water splashed over the rim, darkening the concrete. Cora watched him drink. "Hayes isn't going to let this go," she said, her voice dropping into a harsh whisper. "He gave me until sundown. If I don't crate him, Hayes will come down here with a rifle. It's protocol. The dog is a liability." "A liability," Arthur tasted the word, his face wrinkling in disgust. "You military folks have a sterile word for everything. He's not a liability, miss. He's haunted." "It's the same thing out there," Cora said bitterly. She pointed toward the invisible perimeter of the training ground. "Hesitate because you're haunted. You get someone killed. He broke protocol. He attacked a friendly." Arthur looked at her, really looked at her. His eyes were the faded blue of old denim, but they were sharp, cutting right through the hardened operator facade she wore like a second skin. "Why were you shaking in that pen, then?" Arthur asked. Cora froze. The breath hitched in her throat. "I wasn't." "Don't lie to me," Arthur said softly. "You've got the exact same posture he does. Shoulders up, weight on the balls of your feet, breathing high in your chest. You're waiting for the floor to drop out." "You don't know anything about me," Cora snapped, the words biting, defensive. She pushed herself off the beam, her hand dropping instinctively toward where her sidearm usually sat. The empty space on her thigh felt like a betrayal. "I know that dog is terrified of everything that moves, and you were the only one who stepped in that pen with him anyway," Arthur said, wholly unaffected by her hostility. "I know you're fighting the same ghost." Cora stared at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly. A sharp, hot pressure built behind her eyes. She swallowed hard, forcing it down. She was a Tier 1 operator. She did not cry in barns with strangers. Before she could spit out a retort, a sound caught her attention. The wet, frantic slurping had stopped. Cora looked down. The German Shepherd had finished drinking. He was standing now. He didn't look at Arthur. He was looking at her. The dog took a slow, stiff step toward Cora. Cora stiffened, her muscles locking. She prepared to jump back, prepared for the growl, prepared for the teeth. But the dog didn't growl. His ears were still back, his tail still low. But his eyes were different. The dilated panic had receded, leaving behind a profound, hollow exhaustion. He took another step, closing the distance between them. He was close enough now that Cora could smell the wet dust on his coat and the metallic tang of the blood still drying on his fur. She didn't move. She couldn't. Ranger stopped an inch from her boots. He lowered his heavy, scarred head, hesitated for an agonizing second, and then leaned his weight against her shins. He exhaled, a long, shuddering sigh that rippled through his entire body. Cora looked down at the dog pressing against her legs. The hot pressure behind her eyes broke. A single jagged tear cut a clean line through the dust on her cheek. Slowly, terrified she would break the spell, she uncrossed her arms and lowered her hand, letting her fingers rest lightly on the coarse fur between his shoulder blades. The afternoon bled into evening, painting the Wyoming sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. Inside the barn, the shadows lengthened, stretching across the cracked concrete floor like oil spills. Cora hadn't moved for 3 hours. Her legs were entirely numb, the circulation cut off by the dead weight of the 70-pound German Shepherd asleep across her boots. She didn't care. For the first time in 90 days, the relentless, high-pitched ringing in her ears had faded into a dull, manageable hum. Ranger was dreaming. His back paws twitched rhythmically, and a soft, muffled woof vibrated in his chest. Cora kept her hand firmly planted between his shoulder blades, anchoring him, grounding him. Arthur was at the far end of the barn, a wrench clanking rhythmically against the rusted engine block of the John Deere. The sound was steady, predictable. It didn't sound like a firing pin. It didn't sound like a blast door slamming shut. It was just a man fixing a tractor. The spell broke with the aggressive crunch of tires on gravel. Cora stiffened. Ranger woke instantly. The dog didn't whine, but his head snapped up, ears swiveling toward the open barn doors. The muscles in his neck turned to stone beneath her palm. 2 black SUVs had parked near the fence line. 4 doors slammed in rapid succession. The sound echoed off the corrugated tin roof. Arthur wiped his greasy hands on a red shop rag and walked slowly toward the front of the barn. Cora gently pushed Ranger off her boots and stood up. Her knees screamed in protest. Pins and needles flooded her calves, making her stumble a half step. But she caught herself against the wooden support beam. Hayes was walking up the driveway. He wasn't alone. Evans, the team medic, walked beside him, carrying a hard plastic travel crate by the reinforced handle. It was olive drab, heavily ventilated, and looked exactly like a coffin. "Stay here," Cora muttered to the dog. Ranger ignored her. As she stepped out of the barn and into the cooling twilight air, the shepherd flanked her, pressing his shoulder tight against her left thigh. He kept his head low, eyes locked on the approaching men. A low rumble started in his throat, a warning vibration that Cora felt straight through her tactical pants. Hayes stopped 10 yards away. He looked at the dog, then at Cora. His jaw was set tight enough to crack a molar. "Oh, sun's down, Davies," Hayes said. His voice was flat, carrying perfectly through the quiet evening. He gestured to Evans, who dropped the heavy plastic crate in the dirt with a hollow thud. Load the asset. We roll out in 5. Cora looked at the crate. She thought about the sterile white walls of the Coronado Veterinary Clinic. She thought about the blue juice in the syringe. She thought about the psychological eval she had been forced to sit through. The doctors who looked at her twitching hands and wrote unfit for deployment in their neat little folders. She unclipped the heavy tactical collar from her belt. The metal cobra buckle clanked against the nylon. She held it in her right hand, feeling its rigid weight. No, Cora said. Hayes blinked. The wind picked up, rustling the dry alfalfa in the nearby fields. Excuse me? I said no, Commander. Cora's voice didn't shake. Her stomach was performing a violent, nauseating freefall, but her voice was dead calm. He's not getting in the box. Hayes took a step forward, his hand resting on his belt. Davies, you are towing the line of insubordination. I am giving you a direct order. Load the K-9. The K-9 is washed out, Cora replied. He's combat ineffective, a liability. Your words, Hayes. Which is why he's being euthanized. Which is why he's being retired, Cora corrected. She tossed the heavy tactical collar into the dirt. It landed halfway between them, kicking up a small puff of dust. Asset is permanently decommissioned. Hayes stared at the collar in the dirt, a muscle feathering in his cheek. He looked up at Cora, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. You don't have the authority to reclassify military property. You want to throw away a 10-year career over a broken dog? I will court-martial you, Cora. I will end you. I'm already ended, Hayes, Cora said. The truth of it tasted like ash in her mouth, but it felt right. It felt honest. I haven't slept more than 2 hours a night since Baghdad. I flinch when someone drops a magazine. I'm a broken tool, too. You just haven't found the paperwork to scrap me yet. Hayes didn't have an immediate answer for that. The absolute, raw admission stripped the tactical authority right out of the air. He attacked an operator, Hayes finally said, pointing a rigid finger at Ranger. He drew blood. He defended himself, Arthur's voice rasped from the barn doorway. The old man stepped out, a shotgun broken open and resting casually over his forearm. He wasn't pointing it at anyone, but the implication of the steel was heavy. You pushed him into a corner. He pushed back. Out here, we just call that survival. Hayes looked at the farmer, then back to Cora. The standoff was absolute. Hayes was a pragmatist. He calculated the variables, forced the issue, and he had a violent dog, an armed, unhinged Tier 1 operator, and a civilian landlord with a 12-gauge. Back down, and he lost a piece of equipment that was destined for the incinerator anyway. Hayes looked at Ranger. The German Shepherd wasn't lunging. He wasn't snarling. He was just leaning against Cora's leg, completely anchored to the woman who had stood in the pen with him. Evans! Hayes barked, not taking his eyes off Cora. Leave the crate. Evans looked confused, but he stepped back from the plastic box. You're done, Davies, Hayes said softly, the words carrying a chilling finality. Don't bother reporting to the staging area tomorrow. I'll have your discharge papers routed to a stateside address. Understood, Cora said. Hayes turned on his heel. The gravel crunched under his boots. He and Evans climbed back into the SUVs. The engines roared to life, headlights cutting harsh cones of white light through the settling dust. Cora watched them back down the long dirt driveway, the red taillights eventually disappearing over the horizon. The silence rushed back in, absolute and heavy. Cora stood in the dirt, the cold evening air biting through her sweat-dampened shirt. She had no career. She had no team. She had a mountain of trauma and a dishonorable discharge waiting in the wings. Ranger let out a long breath and nudged her hand with a wet, cold nose. Cora looked down at the dog. She looked at the old farmer leaning against the barn, chewing quietly on a piece of tobacco. "Well," Arthur said softly, his pale eyes catching the last bit of ambient light, "suppose you two better come inside. Gets cold out here at night." Cora closed her eyes. The ringing in her ears was gone. "Yeah," she whispered. "Okay." Sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought with a rifle, but with a little bit of patience and a whole lot of understanding. If Cora and Ranger's journey hit home for you, hit that like button and subscribe for more raw, unfiltered stories. Leave a comment below. Have you ever found healing in the most unexpected place, or had an animal change your life? Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and we'll see you in the next one.